My son's piano teacher never charged us, and what I found in his studio horrified me. Mr. Kenneth Harrington had been teaching my 12-year-old son Ethan piano for 8 months when I realized we'd never paid him a single dollar. I'd been so busy with work and managing our household after my divorce that the finances had slipped through the cracks, but when I finally sat down to reconcile our bank statements, there wasn't a single charge from the music academy where Ethan took lessons every Wednesday evening. I felt terrible about the oversight and immediately called the academy to arrange payment, explaining I'd somehow missed all their invoices. The receptionist sounded confused when I mentioned Mr. Harrington's name, putting me on hold for several minutes before coming back with an even stranger response. "Ma'am, we don't have any instructor by that name working here. Are you sure you have the right music school?" My stomach dropped because I'd personally driven Ethan to this exact building dozens of times, watching him walk through those glass doors into the lobby before driving away to run errands during his hour-long lesson. I told the receptionist I'd been dropping my son off at their location on Maple Street for months, and she insisted they only had 4 piano instructors on staff, none named Kenneth Harrington. She offered to check their visitor logs, but after a few minutes of typing, she confirmed no one by that name had signed in as a guest instructor either. I hung up feeling deeply unsettled and called my ex-husband Derek to see if he knew anything about this arrangement, but he was just as confused as I was about how we'd been sending our son to lessons with someone who apparently didn't work at the school. That evening when I picked Ethan up from his lesson, I decided to actually go inside instead of waiting in the car like usual. The receptionist looked surprised to see me and immediately said she'd been expecting my call earlier. I asked where my son's piano teacher's studio was, and she repeated what she'd told me on the phone. There was no Kenneth Harrington working here. "But my son has been taking lessons here every Wednesday for 8 months, I insisted, feeling my face getting hot with a mixture of embarrassment and alarm. "Can you at least tell me which studio he goes to?" The receptionist checked her computer and said there were no lessons scheduled for anyone named Ethan Walsh on Wednesday evenings, or any other day of the week. I felt the world tilting slightly as I processed this information, my mind racing through every Wednesday for the past 8 months when I'd dropped Ethan off at this building. The receptionist must have seen the panic in my face because she quickly called the manager, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Vega, who came out looking concerned. I explained the entire situation while Patricia listened with increasingly worried expressions, finally saying she wanted to review their security camera footage to figure out what was happening. We went to her office where she pulled up the recordings from various Wednesdays over the past few months, and what we saw made my blood run cold. The footage clearly showed me dropping Ethan off at the front entrance, him walking into the lobby with his backpack, but then instead of going to any of the lesson studios, he immediately walked straight through the building and out a back exit into the parking lot behind the academy. Patricia fast-forwarded through footage from multiple weeks, and the pattern was identical every single time. Ethan entered through the front, walked through the building without stopping, and exited through the back door. "Where is he going?" Patricia asked, but I couldn't answer because I had no idea. We watched footage from the back parking lot camera and saw Ethan getting into a silver sedan that was waiting for him, though the angle and quality of the camera made it impossible to see the driver clearly or read the license plate. The car would drive away with my son inside and return exactly 55 minutes later, dropping Ethan off at the same back exit. He'd walk through the building again, emerging from the front entrance right as I pulled up to collect him, acting like he'd just finished a normal piano lesson. I felt physically sick watching this deception play out on screen week after week, my 12-year-old son being picked up by some stranger and taken to an unknown location for nearly an hour. Patricia immediately said we needed to call the police, and I agreed while pulling out my phone with shaking hands. A patrol officer named Dennis Kowalski arrived within 20 minutes and reviewed the footage himself, his expression growing more serious as he watched. He asked if I'd ever met this piano teacher face-to-face, and I realized with horror that I hadn't, not even once in 8 months. Ethan had told me he'd found Mr. Harrington through a flyer at school advertising affordable private lessons, and since the price seemed reasonable and the location was convenient, I'd agreed without doing any real vetting. Officer Kowalski asked me to call Ethan down from wherever he was in the building, but Patricia informed us he'd never actually entered any of the studios today either, meaning he was currently somewhere else with this mysterious driver. I called Ethan's cell phone immediately, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the device. He answered on the third ring, sounding cheerful and normal, asking if I was running late to pick him up. "Where are you right now?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "At the music academy, waiting in the lobby like always," he said, sounding confused by the question. "Mr. Harrington's lesson ran a bit long today, so I'm just finishing up." I told him to stay exactly where he was, and that I was coming to get him right now, then hung up and ran toward the front lobby with Officer Kowalski following behind me. The lobby was empty except for 2 other parents waiting for their children. There was no sign of Ethan anywhere. I called his phone again and heard it ringing from outside the building, following the sound to the back parking lot where I found my son standing next to the silver sedan we'd seen in the footage. The driver's door was open, but I couldn't see anyone inside from my angle. "Ethan, get away from that car right now," I shouted, running toward him with Officer Kowalski right behind me. Ethan looked startled and confused, stepping back from the vehicle as a man emerged from the driver's seat. He was in his mid-40s with graying hair and wore a cardigan sweater, looking exactly like what you'd imagine a piano teacher would look like, which somehow made the situation even more disturbing. "Mrs. Walsh, I presume?" the man said with a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Kenneth Harrington, Ethan's piano instructor. Is there a problem?" Officer Kowalski immediately stepped forward and asked for identification while I grabbed Ethan and pulled him behind me protectively. Kenneth reached slowly into his pocket and produced a driver's license that confirmed his name, along with a business card that said he was a private music instructor. I teach lessons from my home studio, he explained calmly, seemingly unfazed by the police presence. Ethan has been coming to my house for lessons because the rates are much lower than academy prices. I thought you were aware of this arrangement. I told him I absolutely was not aware, that I'd been under the impression Ethan was taking lessons inside the music academy this entire time. Kenneth looked genuinely surprised by this, turning to Ethan with a concerned expression. Ethan, didn't you tell your mother you'd be coming to my home studio? We discussed this on the first day. Ethan's face had gone pale and he wouldn't meet my eyes, staring at the ground instead. Officer Kowalski asked Kenneth why he'd been picking up a minor and taking him to a private residence without the parent's knowledge or consent, and Kenneth's pleasant demeanor finally cracked slightly. I assumed the parent knew. Ethan said his mother was fine with the arrangement as long as he was getting good instruction. He's been making excellent progress on the piano. Officer Kowalski asked if he could see Kenneth's home studio, and Kenneth hesitated for just a moment before agreeing and providing his address. I drove behind the police car with Ethan in my passenger seat, too angry and scared to speak. When I finally found my voice, I asked him why he'd lied about where he was going every Wednesday for 8 months. Ethan kept his eyes down and said in a small voice that Mr. Harrington had offered him free piano lessons if he didn't tell anyone, saying it would be their secret because Mr. Harrington liked helping talented students who couldn't afford expensive instruction. Did he hurt you? I asked, barely able to get the words out. Ethan shook his head quickly but still wouldn't look at me. No, he just taught me piano, I swear. He's really nice and never did anything weird. But the fact that my son had been trained to keep this secret for months made me question everything he was telling me. We arrived at Kenneth's house, a modest ranch-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood that looked completely normal from the outside. Officer Kowalski knocked on the door while Kenneth fumbled with his keys, and I noticed his hands were shaking now. The pleasant facade was crumbling as he realized the situation was spiraling out of his control. He opened the door and led us inside to what he called his music studio, which was actually a converted garage with a piano, some chairs, and music books on shelves. Everything looked innocent enough, almost disappointingly normal given the horrifying scenarios that had been playing through my mind. Officer Kowalski asked if he could look around, and Kenneth agreed, though he asked that we respect his privacy in other areas of the house. While the officer searched the studio area, I examined the space more carefully and noticed something strange about one of the walls. The far wall of the studio had what looked like soundproofing panels installed, which seemed excessive for a home music studio in a residential neighborhood. There were also multiple cameras mounted in the corners of the room, small ones that you might miss if you weren't looking carefully. I pointed these out to Officer Kowalski, who immediately asked Kenneth to explain the surveillance equipment. Kenneth said they were for recording student performances so they could review their progress, which sounded reasonable on the surface but felt wrong given everything else. Officer Kowalski asked to see the recordings, and Kenneth became visibly nervous, saying they were stored on a computer in his office and he'd need to retrieve them. The officer insisted on accompanying him, and I stayed in the studio with Ethan, looking around more carefully now that I knew what to watch for. That's when I noticed the door. It was built into the wall behind a bookshelf, barely visible unless you were looking at the right angle. The door was painted the same color as the wall and had no obvious handle, just a small keypad lock partially hidden by a stack of music books. My heart started racing as I realized Kenneth had deliberately concealed this entrance. I called out to Officer Kowalski, who came back into the studio immediately, and I showed him what I'd found. His expression darkened, and he asked Kenneth directly what was behind the door. Kenneth's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, fear, resignation, and finally a strange kind of defiance. That's my personal storage area. It's not relevant to Ethan's lessons. Officer Kowalski said he needed to see what was behind that door immediately, and Kenneth refused, saying it was private property and the officer would need a warrant. The standoff lasted only a few seconds before Officer Kowalski called for backup, and additional units began arriving at the house. I was asked to take Ethan outside while they secured the scene, and a female officer named Rachel Ortiz stayed with us in the front yard. Ethan kept insisting he'd never been through that door and didn't know it existed, that he'd only ever been in the main studio area learning piano. Mr. Harrington was really good at teaching, he said, seeming genuinely distressed that his teacher was in trouble. He never did anything bad to me, Mom. I promise. But the fact that Kenneth had built a hidden room behind his studio told me there was much more to this situation than piano lessons. Over the next hour, more police arrived, including detectives and what looked like a forensics team. I overheard radio chatter about getting an emergency warrant to search the locked room, with officers treating this as a possible child endangerment situation. A detective named Lawrence Park came to interview Ethan and me separately, asking detailed questions about every interaction with Kenneth Harrington. Ethan repeated his story. Kenneth had approached him at school with a flyer for piano lessons, offering them for free because he said he enjoyed teaching talented students and didn't care about the money. Kenneth had specifically requested that Ethan not mention the arrangement to anyone because other students might get jealous about the free lessons. This had seemed like a reasonable request to my 12-year-old son, who was flattered by the attention and excited about learning piano. Detective Park asked if Kenneth had ever touched Ethan inappropriately, or made him uncomfortable in any way, and Ethan firmly insisted nothing like that had happened. He was just a regular teacher. We did scales and practiced songs, and he showed me techniques for my finger positions. That's it. The detective asked how many other students Ethan had seen at Kenneth's studio, and Ethan thought for a moment before saying he'd never seen any other students there. Mr. Harrington said he liked to focus on one student at a time for the full hour, so I always had private lessons. This detail seemed to concern Detective Park, who made notes and asked more questions about the layout of the house and whether Ethan had ever been in any other rooms besides the studio. Ethan said Kenneth had let him use the bathroom once when it was an emergency, and he'd seen a normal living room and kitchen but nothing unusual. The detective asked what prompted Ethan to need the bathroom during a lesson, and Ethan said he'd drunk a lot of water before coming that day. This questioning continued for over an hour while I sat there feeling more horrified with each revelation. Finally, Detective Park said they'd obtained their warrant and were about to open the locked door. He asked if we wanted to leave the property before they did, but I needed to know what Kenneth had been hiding behind that door, what my son had been so close to every Wednesday for 8 months. Officer Ortiz stayed with Ethan by the police cars while I was allowed to stand outside the house with Detective Park. We watched through the window as officers in the studio cut through the lock on the hidden door. When they finally got it open, I saw the lead officer's body language change immediately, his posture stiffening before he spoke urgently into his radio. More officers rushed into the house and someone called for additional forensics teams. Detective Park's phone rang and he answered it, listening intently before his expression became grim. "Mrs. Walsh, I need you to sit down for a moment," he said, guiding me to the hood of his car. "What we found behind that door is going to be part of an active investigation. I can't share specific details yet, but I want you to know that based on our initial assessment, your son appears to have been telling the truth about his interactions with Mr. Harrington. The room behind that door was never used during Ethan's lessons." I asked what was in the room, my voice barely working. Detective Park hesitated before saying it appeared to be an extensive recording setup with video equipment pointed at multiple screens, showing live camera feeds from various locations. "We're still processing the scene, but it appears Mr. Harrington was running some kind of surveillance operation. We found feeds from several schools, parks, and other locations where children gather. This goes far beyond anything to do with piano lessons." My stomach turned as the implications became clear. Kenneth hadn't been grooming Ethan directly. He'd been using the piano lessons as cover for something much larger and more disturbing. The detective explained they were bringing in specialists from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit because the scope of what they'd found suggested a network rather than a single individual. Over the next few days, the investigation exploded into something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. Kenneth's house was completely secured as a crime scene, while forensic computer specialists worked to trace all the camera feeds they'd discovered. It turned out Kenneth had been planting hidden cameras in bathrooms and changing areas at 5 different schools across 3 counties, collecting footage for years. The FBI found evidence of thousands of videos stored on encrypted servers, and Kenneth's computer history showed he'd been trading this content with other predators online. Detective Park called me in for several follow-up interviews, explaining they were trying to understand how Kenneth had selected Ethan as a cover story. "We believe he specifically targeted students who seemed lonely or isolated, kids who might not talk much about their activities with their parents," the detective explained gently. This assessment stung because it was accurate. Ethan had been struggling socially after the divorce, and I'd been so busy with work that I hadn't been as engaged with his daily life as I should have been. Kenneth had apparently approached several students at different schools with similar offers of free lessons in various subjects: piano, guitar, tutoring. Most parents had been suspicious and refused, but a handful had fallen for the scheme just like I had. We've identified 6 other children who were taking lessons with Kenneth, though like Ethan, none of them appear to have been physically harmed or had any idea about the hidden room, Detective Park said. The FBI discovered Kenneth was part of a much larger network of predators who shared surveillance equipment and footage through encrypted channels on the dark web. His house had served as a technical hub where he processed and distributed content to other members of this network. The hidden cameras had been broadcasting live feeds that were being watched by potentially hundreds of people around the world. This revelation made me physically ill. Kenneth hadn't needed to personally abuse the children he was teaching because he was making money by facilitating others' access to surveillance footage. The scope of the operation was staggering. FBI agent Michaela Torres, who took over the investigation, explained they'd traced connections to similar operations in 6 other states. Kenneth had been just one node in a larger network that had been operating for over a decade. The piano lessons and other tutoring services were the perfect cover, Agent Torres explained during one of our meetings. Parents naturally want to support their children's education and might overlook warning signs when someone is offering help, especially affordable help. Kenneth exploited that goodwill systematically. I asked why he'd never charged us for the lessons, and Agent Torres said that was part of the manipulation tactic. By making it free, he eliminated the paper trail of payments that might have prompted questions. He also created a sense of obligation. You'd feel bad investigating someone who was being so generous with their time. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and clearly well practiced. The investigation uncovered that Kenneth's real income came from the surveillance network, not from any legitimate teaching. Bank records showed regular deposits from offshore accounts totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years. He'd been living a completely double life, appearing as a struggling private music teacher while actually running a highly profitable child exploitation operation. As more details emerged, I struggled with overwhelming guilt about how I'd failed to protect my son. I'd dropped him off at an unknown location for months without doing any basic verification, too distracted by my own life to notice the obvious red flags. Ethan needed therapy to process the situation, though thankfully the therapist confirmed he showed no signs of direct trauma from his interactions with Kenneth. He's processing the betrayal of trust from an adult he respected, the therapist explained, but there's no indication of sexual abuse or physical harm. He was essentially an unwitting pawn in a much larger scheme. This should have been comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been incredibly lucky, that things could have been so much worse. The school district where Kenneth had approached Ethan immediately launched their own investigation into security protocols, discovering he'd been posing as a parent volunteer to gain access to buildings where he'd planted cameras, He'd used fake identification and had apparently been doing this across multiple districts for years without being caught. The schools faced significant liability for the security breaches, and several administrators were placed on leave pending reviews of their procedures. Other parents whose children had been taking lessons with Kenneth contacted me as the story broke in local news, and we formed an informal support group to help each other navigate the legal and emotional aftermath. None of the other children had been physically harmed either, but all of them were dealing with the psychological impact of learning their trusted teacher had been using them as cover for a predatory operation. One mother told me her daughter had been taking guitar lessons with Kenneth for over a year, and like Ethan, the girl had believed she was simply receiving generous free instruction from a kind teacher. The FBI eventually identified over 40 children across multiple states who had been approached by Kenneth or other members of his network with similar offers of free lessons or tutoring. Most parents had refused or the children hadn't been interested, but the ones who had participated were all dealing with similar feelings of violation and betrayal. Agent Torres organized several group meetings where families could share information and support each other, which helped reduce the isolation we all felt. The case against Kenneth expanded as investigators uncovered the full extent of the network. He was charged with multiple federal crimes including production and distribution of child exploitation material, computer crimes, and conspiracy. The FBI arrested 7 other individuals connected to the network in coordinated raids across the country, shutting down what they described as one of the largest child surveillance operations they'd ever discovered. Kenneth's trial was scheduled for 8 months later, and I was informed I'd likely need to testify about how he'd gained access to Ethan. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named David Chang, explained they were building cases against each network member separately, while also prosecuting the conspiracy charges. "We want to make sure everyone involved faces maximum penalties," he said during our preparation meeting. Kenneth's role as the technical operator and content distributor makes him a key defendant in the overall case. As the trial date approached, more disturbing details emerged about Kenneth's background. He'd been a legitimate music teacher 20 years ago, but had lost his teaching certification after inappropriate behavior with students at a private school. Rather than face prosecution then, he'd accepted a plea deal that kept him off the sex offender registry but barred him from working in schools. He'd spent the following 2 decades building his surveillance network, while occasionally posing as a private instructor to maintain his cover story. This history should have prevented him from getting anywhere near children, but the gaps in background check systems and his careful avoidance of official employment had allowed him to operate undetected for decades. The revelation that Kenneth had a previous history made me even more angry at myself for not doing proper research. A simple background check would have revealed his past issues, but I'd trusted my son's assurance that he'd found a good teacher and never followed up. Detective Park tried to reassure me that Kenneth had been extremely skilled at manipulation and deception, that he'd fooled many people over many years. He specifically targeted busy, stressed parents who might not have time to thoroughly investigate, the detective said. "You're not the first person to fall for this, and unfortunately you probably won't be the last. These predators are constantly evolving their tactics." The trial itself was emotionally devastating to sit through as prosecutors laid out the evidence of Kenneth's operation in disturbing detail. The jury saw evidence of the hidden room behind his studio, the extensive surveillance equipment, and samples of the footage he'd collected and distributed. Kenneth's defense attorneys tried to argue he'd been documenting the locations for legitimate security purposes, but this claim fell apart under the weight of evidence showing him actively trading the content with known predators on encrypted platforms. The prosecution presented testimony from FBI digital forensics experts who'd traced thousands of videos back to Kenneth's equipment, along with chat logs where he discussed the footage in explicitly predatory terms. I had to testify about my interactions with Kenneth and how he'd gained access to Ethan, describing every detail of those 8 months when I'd unknowingly sent my son to this man's house. Kenneth watched me from the defense table with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between remorse and defiance. When it was his turn to testify in his own defense, he claimed he'd never intended to harm any children and had simply gotten caught up in something that spiraled out of control. "I was lonely after my wife died," he said, his voice cracking with emotion that might have been genuine or might have been performance. "The piano lessons were real. I enjoyed teaching those kids. The other stuff was a mistake, an addiction I couldn't control." The prosecutor demolished this narrative during cross-examination, presenting evidence of years of careful planning and deliberate deception. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Kenneth was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence given his age. The judge described his crimes as particularly heinous because of how he'd exploited children's desire to learn and parents' trust in educational settings. "You weaponized the natural human impulse to nurture children's growth," the judge said during sentencing. "You turned learning opportunities into opportunities for exploitation. This court has no sympathy for your situation." Several other network members received similar sentences as their cases proceeded through the courts over the following year. The FBI's investigation continued to expand as they traced connections to other potential predators and worked to identify all the locations where cameras had been planted. Schools across 3 states had to conduct comprehensive security sweeps to find and remove hidden surveillance equipment, discovering cameras in locations that had been broadcasting for years. The financial cost of this security upgrade ran into millions of dollars, and several districts faced lawsuits from parents whose children had been recorded. The broader implications of the case sparked state legislation requiring enhanced background checks for anyone working with children in any capacity, even informal private arrangements. Lawmakers used Kenneth's case as an example of how predators could exploit gaps in the system by avoiding official employment while still gaining access to potential victims. The new laws required private instructors to register with a state database and undergo the same background checks as public school employees, closing the loophole Kenneth had exploited. 2 years after Kenneth's arrest, I still struggled with guilt and hypervigilance about Ethan's safety. He'd recovered remarkably well from the experience according to his therapist, though he'd lost interest in music entirely and refused to go near a piano. It's associated with too much negative emotion now, the therapist explained. Maybe someday he'll be ready to try again, but forcing it will only make things worse. Ethan had found other interests, including computer programming, and ironically, he'd become interested in cybersecurity after learning about how the FBI had traced Kenneth's network. He talked about maybe working in law enforcement someday to help catch predators like Kenneth, turning his experience into motivation rather than trauma. Our support group of affected families continued to meet monthly, providing ongoing emotional support as we all processed the long-term impacts. Several parents had divorced or separated under the stress, unable to overcome the guilt and blame that had crept into their relationships. Derek and I had actually grown closer through the crisis, putting aside our differences to focus on Ethan's well-being and recovery. We'd started family therapy together to improve our communication and make sure we were both fully engaged in Ethan's life, rather than leaving gaps a predator might exploit. The experience had fundamentally changed how I approached parenting, making me simultaneously more protective and more aware of helicopter parenting risks. Finding the right balance between vigilance and allowing Ethan independence was an ongoing challenge that I worked through with my therapist weekly. The broader community impact was significant as the case had drawn national media attention to the vulnerabilities in private instruction arrangements. Parents everywhere were suddenly questioning tutors and coaches they'd trusted for years, leading to uncomfortable conversations and sometimes unjust accusations against innocent teachers. This collateral damage was unfortunate, but perhaps necessary to shake people out of complacency about child safety. Several legitimate private instructors I knew had to completely revamp their business practices to include transparent parent communication and open-door policies to reassure nervous families. One silver lining was that schools became much more serious about visitor protocols and security systems. The casual approach that had allowed Kenneth to plant cameras as a fake volunteer was replaced with strict badge requirements, escort policies, and regular security audits. Students initially complained about the restrictions, but most parents felt the trade-offs were worthwhile if it prevented future predators from gaining access. Technology companies also took notice, and several developed specialized camera detection equipment marketed to schools and public spaces. 3 years after the trial, the FBI called to inform me they'd finally completed their investigation into the full extent of the network. Agent Torres reported they'd identified and arrested a total of 23 individuals across 12 states, all of whom had been sharing surveillance footage and coordinating their operations through encrypted channels. The investigation had led to the removal of over 300 hidden cameras from schools, parks, recreational facilities, and other locations where children gathered. The total number of children who'd been recorded without knowledge or consent was estimated in the thousands. The FBI had recovered and secured all the footage, ensuring it couldn't continue circulating online, though Agent Torres admitted that some content had likely been copied and stored by individuals they hadn't identified. "We shut down the organized network," she explained, "but we can't guarantee every single copy of every file was destroyed. That's the terrible reality of digital crimes." This knowledge haunted me. The idea that footage of children, including potentially Ethan being near Kenneth's house, might still exist somewhere on someone's computer. The therapist helped me work through these intrusive thoughts, reminding me that we'd done everything possible to prevent further harm, and that dwelling on what we couldn't control would only damage my mental health. Ethan, now 15, had become an advocate for child safety in online spaces, and had even given presentations at his school about recognizing grooming behaviors and manipulation tactics. His resilience amazed me, and I was incredibly proud of how he'd transformed his experience into education that might protect other children. He'd connected with other survivors through a national organization that supported children affected by exploitation, finding community with people who understood what he'd been through in ways I never could. Our relationship had become stronger and more open after the ordeal forced us to have difficult conversations about trust, safety, and the reality that not all adults could be trusted. Ethan told me recently that while he wished it had never happened, he felt the experience had taught him important lessons about critically evaluating situations rather than blindly trusting authority figures. Looking back now, 5 years after that horrible discovery, I can see how many warning signs I'd missed in my exhaustion and distraction. The fact that Kenneth never charged us should have been an immediate red flag, as should Ethan's vagueness about where exactly the lessons took place. My failure to ever meet the teacher face-to-face or verify his credentials was negligent, plain and simple, but I've learned to balance that guilt with recognition that Kenneth was a skilled predator who'd successfully deceived many parents and evaded law enforcement for decades. The important thing was that when I finally did discover the deception, I acted immediately and cooperated fully with the investigation. If I could go back and change anything, I would be more engaged in Ethan's daily life and activities, asking more questions and verifying information rather than taking his word at face value. But I can't change the past, only learn from it and try to prevent similar situations for other families. That's why I've become involved in parent education programs that teach families how to vet private instructors and recognize grooming behaviors. Speaking at school assemblies and community events is uncomfortable, requiring me to repeatedly relive the most traumatic experience of my life. But if it prevents even one other child from being exploited, it's worth the emotional cost. The most important lesson I share with other parents is simple. Trust your instincts. If something feels off about a situation involving your child, investigate immediately. Don't worry about seeming paranoid or overprotective. The damage from dismissing legitimate concerns is far greater than the awkwardness of asking difficult questions. Kenneth Harrington exploited exactly that reluctance to seem suspicious or ungrateful, counting on parents being too polite to thoroughly question his generous offer of free lessons. That politeness, that assumption that adults who work with children must be trustworthy, is what predators depend on to operate. We have to be willing to be rude, to demand answers, to verify information even when it feels uncomfortable. Our children's safety has to take priority over social niceties. In the end, what I found in Kenneth's studio was far worse than any physical harm he might have inflicted on my son. The surveillance network he'd built had violated thousands of children across multiple states, creating permanent records of their lives that were distributed to predators around the world. The scope of the harm was so massive it was almost incomprehensible. But in focusing on that overwhelming darkness, it's easy to miss the light. The FBI agents who worked tirelessly to dismantle the network, the prosecutors who secured justice, the other parents who supported each other through the aftermath, and most of all, the resilience of the children who survived this violation of their trust and privacy. Ethan is thriving now, preparing for college and planning to study cybersecurity and digital forensics. He's turned his experience into purpose, determined to become part of the solution to protecting other children from similar exploitation. That transformation, from victim to advocate, is what gives me hope that we can create a safer world for future generations. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.